All right, good morning. It is November 15th, 2018. My name is Katie Schank, and today I'm here at the Carter Library in Atlanta, Georgia, with Miss Dorothy Padgett to conduct an interview for the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Dorothy, or Dot Padgett, is a resident of historic Douglasville. In 1975, when Jimmy Carter announced he would run for president, Ms. Padgett, along with other loyal supporters, friends, neighbors of Jimmy Carter, and elected officials, organized a campaign group that would come to be known as the Peanut Brigade. After Carter's election, Ms. Padgett was appointed Assistant Chief of Protocol at the U.S. Department of State and served in Washington, D.C. from 1977 to 1979. She also worked for many years as an events coordinator at Atlanta Arrangements. Ms. Padgett was also a member of the Democratic National Committee, the Georgia Council for the Arts, and the Metropolitan Mental Health Association. She presently serves on the Carter Center Board of Counselors. In 2016, Ms. Padgett wrote a book titled Jimmy Carter, Elected President with Pocket Change and Peanuts. Countless books have chronicled Carter's unlikely rise to prominence in national politics and the history of his presidency. Yet Padgett's book offers an insider's view of Carter, as well as a recounting of the Peanut Brigade that makes her work unlike the outsiders who have written of Carter's ascendancy. Ms. Padgett, I'm honored to be able to speak with you today and look forward to a discussion about your role in Jimmy Carter's election, Georgia politics, past and present, and your thoughts on political campaigns and how they've changed. But first, let's start with some biographical information. If you could tell us about yourself, your parents, where you were born, where you went to school.
Oh, all right. That's easy to do. Thank you,
We start with
first
the
of
easy
all,
questions.
for inviting me to do this.
Sure.
And putting this on record about how Jimmy Carter and my association with him. I was born in Sandersville, Georgia, which is in Washington County. Sandersville, of course, is known for their kaolin, the chalk that there are very few deposits anywhere in the world. But I left there at a very early age and did move to Douglas County, and I went to school in Douglas County, graduated there from high school, and attended very briefly the Atlanta extension of the University of Georgia, which is Georgia State now.
Okay.
But that was many, many years ago.
And what did you study while you were there?
What did I study while I was there? Mostly, I never let my book learning interfere with my education, so I had a good time mostly.
Okay. And how did you first become involved in politics?
I had a good friend, Charles Kerbo, in the Carter campaign. I had really never been involved with politics other than the politics of running PTAs and working in things of that nature locally. But Charles Kerbo was a good friend of my husband, and I had gotten to know him, and he was, of course, helping Jimmy Carter in his campaign for governor. Mm-hmm. And he introduced me to President Carter, or Governor Carter, Senator Carter at the time. Okay. He's been so many things. But it was something that, for some reason, I just wanted to do. This man came to my house, I met him, and it seemed to be something that I, as a mother of 4 children, I really didn't have time to do it, but he appealed to me very much so that I wanted to go to work for him.
How old were your children at the time?
The what?
How old were your children at the time?
How old were my children?
Well, not now, but when you decided to get involved.
I think most of them were used where they were either sub-teens or teenagers.
Okay.
So they were able to manage by themselves at that time.
So when did you actually begin to work on the elections campaigns for Carter? You met him, but was it immediately that you met him and then you began working?
Oh, well, when he ran for governor.
Okay.
Oh, it was a pretty tight race. He had no money. That seemed to be what has run through all of his campaigns. And he depended on people so much. And this was in 1970 when he ran for governor the second time.
Okay.
And I met him and immediately went to work for him, and they asked me, put me in charge of the women's campaign for the state of Georgia. And that was showed very much so how much they needed volunteers to help them, because I really didn't have that kind of experience. But I did know a lot of people throughout the state of Georgia. My husband was with the Trust Company of Georgia, and I traveled with him. And but unfortunately, most of the bankers were not supporting Carter. But it became easy to work with them. Rosalind Carter was an absolute dream to work with. And a friend of mine, we joined together and started just traveling all over the state with her and meeting people. And it was surprising to us how easily we could get women to come together to meet Rosalind Carter and Miss Lillian. And it was really a big surprise to me how easy we could get them to come to meet them and hear them. And Rosalind was not very, at the time, she was very shy.
You write about that in your book.
Yes, I know it. And she was not very outgoing, but she did an absolute wonderful job. And she talked about Jimmy, and people believed her. And it was just that one-on-one personal contact that I think that helped them so much. And they worked so hard and met so many people personally. So that was how I got to know him when he ran for governor.
Okay. And then based on your good work, he brought you on again.
Yes, when he was running for the office I happened to be in the campaign office one time, and it was just a little cramped space in downtown Atlanta, and the telephone was ringing, and I just picked up the phone because nobody else was there to pick it up. And I had just dropped by for a few minutes, and Rosalind was on the other line, and she said, "Oh, Dot, I'm glad it's you. Take down my schedule. I'm in Florida." And I thought, Rosalind, I'm not working for this campaign. But I did very shortly after that. They asked me if I would help raise some money. Okay. And I started doing things again, scheduling with her. And it's absolutely amazing when you think about the amount of money that's spent now, that we were asking people to donate $10.
And that was a big ask back then.
But, well, we were working then under the federal laws. Okay. And the money then could, if you raised $10, it could be matched with federal funds. And so they did a lot of really good, serious bookkeeping. It's totally amazing to me. And I think the amounts of money that are spent now are just obscene. I would like to see us sometime have some sort of reform. I don't think it'll ever happen. But
when you see what you were able to do with so little money.
What you could do with just people power, and it was, I don't know that will ever happen again. I really hope that someday we can get back to that. I know there are people knocking on doors, but I don't think they have that personal contact with the candidate. And I know there are people that are working very, very hard. So if you'll ask another question.
Sure. So you weren't involved in Carter's first campaign for governor when he lost in the primary, but in that second campaign, was there talk about what had happened in the first campaign and what people were learning from and how you were trying to do it differently? Or was it just more of the same and just better?
Well, there were so few people in that first campaign, and it was so quickly. And I think what they had done was probably save some names and a few people that were going to support them. But they would go into a town with maybe 3 names. And it was just amazing to me how Carter and how Jimmy and Rosen both had so much appeal. And I don't know what people were looking for then, because we had 2 good candidates running. We had a lot of good candidates running. So you had to do something to put yourself, set yourself apart from others. And that's what happened with the presidential campaign in New Hampshire. There were 7, 8, 9 Democratic candidates in that race, in the primaries.
It's a big pool.
And they were good people. So here we have a peanut farmer from Georgia. So how do you set yourself apart from these other people that were in the news, well known? Carter had no, I guess probably 3% recognition. I don't know what it was then. And that was when they started the idea of going and knocking on doors and carrying Georgians to New Hampshire. And it was interesting for us. And we had a lot of stories to tell.
It was winter
in New Hampshire. It was freezing cold. And nobody was out on the streets. I know there was one of my favorite stories was the mayor's wife from Plains. Mm-hmm. Knocked on a door, and they just would barely open the door enough that you could just hand them a brochure. And she handed them the brochure, and she says, "I'm up here from Georgia to ask you to vote for my friend Jimmy Carter for president." But she said, "I am so damn cold. I don't care who you vote for." They invited her in. I think it was her honesty. You know, there was just something different about a Southern lady telling them how cold she was. And so they invited her in. They sat around the kitchen table. They invited some of their friends in.
Oh, goodness.
And that, you know, New Hampshire gets a lot of publicity. I think Iowa is taking a little bit away from them now. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's purely Jimmy Carter, what he did in Iowa when nobody was paying attention to it. But there were, you know, just that few, but there again, that's where the media plays such a big role, because to win the New Hampshire primary really puts you on the track to for bigger things. And so that was so very important.
It really accelerated his campaign.
Correct, yeah, and that was where they were headed, and that was the strategy.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you were in New Hampshire, trudging through the snow in weather you most likely had not encountered previously, you were there to acquaint people with who Jimmy Carter was. But did you also feel that you had to dispel any myths about the South, about what Southerners were like? Or did you just find the people of New Hampshire welcoming and really just interested in hearing about Carter?
I think it was many things that went into that. We not only knocked on a door, and we really didn't have a lot of opportunities because people were, except for the few occasions like that. And but the idea that people were going around and they followed, CBS I think followed me, mm-hmm. and the television attention that the people were seeing, that attracted attention. And it said, well, we'll read about this man. And we had some very good material. And we just targeted the people that would be voting in the Democratic primaries. So it was well handled and well planned. And so I think that was after we were in a house, we would write a note, a personal note, and thank them for coming to the door. And it was a combination of a lot of things. And I believe that none of the other candidates, by the time we did this, mm-hmm. it was too late for them to organize anything that was similar. So I think it was just a good campaign strategy that worked.
And who was organizing all of that? This is a time before computers. You can't Correct. Just quickly pull up this information.
Well, you know, we had those little 3x5 cards. Mm-hmm. We had a lot of those.
Goodness.
And we had information on them about when we would go to a door and we would knock on a door. Hamilton Jordan, who was the campaign director, came up with it. Chris Brown was the coordinator in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. And of course, Jimmy with people who were advising him. It started with the idea of how do we set this man apart. And that they came up with it, and it happened to be a really good idea. And of course, we paid our own expenses.
That's interesting. So speak a little bit more about that. They said, please come, give us your time, trudge through the snow, and by the way, you have to buy your ticket for your flight. You have
Correct.
to pay for your hotel. We paid all of our own
expenses. And that would surprise people. Mm-hmm. You know, New Hampshire was accustomed to this, though. This was not the first time this has happened in their state. They were accustomed to people coming to their doors, knocking. But mostly it was not people that personally knew the candidate. Mm-hmm. And it was not a mature person like me or an elected official from the state of Georgia, maybe that had served with Jimmy, and it was not the same type of people. I think there was more perhaps maturity, and it made it much more believable.
Sure.
I think that was it. And then when people would say, "You mean you paid your own expenses to come up here to do this?" Well, if you think that much of this person, then yeah, we'll take your brochures and we'll look at it and we'll think about voting. And then, of course, the combination of each card had something on it that would say 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. If you thought it was somebody that actually would get out and vote, you would put a 1 or 2. And then the campaign took it from there, and they made sure that those people did get out and vote. So it was a good strategy. We were just a big part of that.
So the paying for yourself was necessity, but then it also worked to your advantage in the
did,
strategy.
Indeed.
It speaks volumes.
But then the reason that we went on from there is there was such a lack of money. Carter really did not have that much money in the primaries because we were under the federal laws and we were only allotted, I think in the primaries it was $21 million. Can you imagine?
No.
I mean, that is such a small amount of money.
Pocket change.
And correct, pocket change. And the Peanuts were the grassroots workers and the volunteers, and there was such a lack of staff that they could pay for. So they asked us quite suddenly, "Dot, could you get people to go to another state?" So Wisconsin was the next state that we were going in. Florida, I'm sorry. Oh, Florida was really, really tough. And if he could win New Hampshire and then win Florida, that would set him apart, and he would be not just a regional candidate. And Florida was so important. And I think every person that I had ever known that knew Jimmy Carter came to Florida. It was just amazing how people would respond to a letter or a phone call. We're getting a plane load, or we're having people, and it was the appeal of Jimmy and Rosalind Carter, no doubt about that.
And probably success in New Hampshire and geography. It was a lot closer for people to come.
Right, they would come
from Georgia. We
did buses. We carried buses down into Florida, and then people traveled on their own. So we worked. At the time, we did not realize we were working that closely with the strategy of the campaign, because I didn't. My job was just to get people on those buses.
Sure. And
I stayed on the phone and, call people and then organizing that. And people were having a good time. And almost anywhere we were, Rosalind or Jimmy would be there at some part of the time. Now, they did not show up much in Florida because they were busy in other places.
Okay.
But there again, it was very successful.
Yeah, but that helps morale too, to have the candidate.
Yeah. He was very conscious of the people that were out working for him. And it was but those people had known him over the years and respected him. And I think one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book was the loyalty. It occurred to me one day, I had this book of people who had served with him in the Senate. And it was a large book. They don't put those out anymore. They're very expensive. And I looked at it and I thought, those are the very same people that helped him to be a Georgia State Senator, Governor, and President of the United States, and now they're helping him in the Carter Center. And that speaks so much for a person, that you'll have that kind of loyalty. And that was the first reason that I decided to write a book about them.
Okay. So backing up a little bit, and maybe we can also talk about why Florida was so difficult. But I did have a question, because this was a huge issue in the day and still is, but about issues about race and segregation in Carter's campaigning.
If you what?
So What role did issues of race and segregation play in Carter's campaigning? Because he's a Democrat, and as governor, he's following other Democrats, but there's a noticeable difference in their politics and a shift and a change in the Democratic Party at that time. So how did he distinguish himself from other Georgia Democrats, and how did he address issues of race and segregation?
Well, it was a total different time then, absolutely. He of course enlisted the help of Andrew Young very, very early. And Andrew Young was better known than Jimmy Carter at the time.
Right.
And when he asked, and Andy was not he didn't know that much about Carter, and he was going to put himself out there. So he was very careful about whether he would how much he would get involved with this race. He, of course, wanted to because it was a fellow Georgian. But Andy was very careful. But he was tremendous help. Anywhere that you put his name out there, then you almost automatically would have a certain community of people that would come and support your candidate. So he was a big help. He had there were several members of the General Assembly that are still in the General Assembly now, and they would travel with us. But as far as it being just a glaring part of it, no, it did not seem to be at all. It just seemed to be a natural thing that if you had a strong member of the black community, and if you could get them to campaign with you or be a part of it, then you would know that would be very helpful. But we didn't. It didn't seem to be any problems whatsoever.
So there were not like explicit questions that would come up,
and people were not so aware of if they made a statement. We knew that it was somebody supported you. You knew that you were not going to discriminate against somebody, or you were not trying to offend anyone, and so it worked very easily for us. In Wisconsin, Wisconsin is an interesting town. Milwaukee, and we were there, and I think that it's very in the 70s, in 1976. It seemed to be a town that there were different ethnic communities, very much so. And we would go to a park that would be the African American community, and we could campaign there as easily. They had the mayor of that city, though, was very well known and very well liked. So we went as easily from a German community to any community that we wanted to, and campaigned. So it seemed to be very easily done.
Okay.
And it seemed to be a campaign that, there's some Georgians up here, let's go see them. I think we're going to like them. And they seem to like what we do and seem to have an interest in what we're doing. And Jimmy's reputation by then had sort of reached some of these communities when he was governor. And I think when he was in some of his writings and some of his speeches, he very early on talked about the injustice that he had witnessed when he was growing up. So I think they recognized him as a type of person that he would be following the type of person that he was when he was growing up. And as you've read, if you know him, if you've studied him, you know he talks a lot about Miss Lillian.
Yes.
And how she crossed all lines. So I think that was a big help too. I think people just somehow knew that and recognized that as a candidate and knew it to be true, because it was not something that some ad had just said about him.
Sure, it was not new rhetoric that he was putting out there. It was a track record of...
Well, it was part of his the fabric of his life, I think. And that, for some reason, that had a very concrete way of people being able to say, I think I like this candidate.
Okay. So when he was elected governor, even though he was following a long line of Democrats, as I was saying, the party was shifting. And why do you think he was the candidate of choice at the time? Was the demographics of Georgia shifting? Were people's ideas about what they wanted shifting?
I don't think so much then. In the Democratic Party then was made up of some very prominent people in partners in law firms, and it seemed a little bit that it was kind of on a level of a group of people that maybe they were in control, but I believe that they were people that really wanted the best for Georgia. I don't think that there were people that were looking for gains for themselves. And it seemed, at the time that he ran for governor, my husband actually was involved with the Democratic Party, and he was not there for any gain for himself. Mm-hmm. But it was a time when you very easily could see that the party was looking for what is best for the state of Georgia, economically, education, and the things that we needed to make Georgia rise up a little bit. Excuse me.
Okay, so we talked about the Democratic Party in Georgia. How did that translate to what was happening nationally with the party?
At the same time that we were having this, maybe perhaps a very strong party and in the state of Georgia, the Democratic Party nationally was beginning to change a good bit. And that was when they were beginning to do quotas. And it was in the early stages, and they had a lot of things that they really needed to work out, and it worked. But in the 1970, early 1970s, mm-hmm. It was sort of fractured.
Okay.
But they were trying to make it into a more democratic party, and by including everyone into it, which was good. Mm-hmm. It was just the very first time and a very start, and it had some I don't say that it had some bad failures, but it had some things that had to be worked out, mm-hmm. and nationally, and so I think a lot of good came out of it, and a lot of the things that are happening now with women being encouraged to run, mm-hmm. and I think the things that came out of that party were necessary and absolutely have set the pattern for the things that happen tremendously that we've seen this year so much. Sure. Is that different groups of people are running and winning, actually winning elections.
Or coming very close.
So, yeah, that was the foundation of that started back in the early 70s with the Democratic Party nationally.
And when you say they were working out their quotas, what did you mean by that?
Well, the quotas, you would have so many women, and then it was divided up with the races, some African American women, men, and it was divided. Mm-hmm. And that was how they had brought it down. And when you send the delegates to the conventions, mm-hmm. it was a quota system.
Okay, so they were reworking what those quotas
Correct.
Would be, and
even in our own state, there were people that were left off, even if they had a tremendous role in the party, mm-hmm. because there were certain quotas that had to be met, and I wish I could remember more about it then. I just remember there was a lot of things that would take place mm-hmm. when we would go around the state, and one of the things that I do remember is that on a Saturday morning when you would go to a meeting, maybe a lot of people were busy, mm-hmm. but there might be a busload of students from a university that was close by. and they were given a vote. So, they were able to vote for whoever they want to, and sometimes we might not get people that we thought were that much interested in the party or even knew that much about it.
But they were there.
It had to, there were a lot of things that had to be worked out. But it was the foundation of what we are seeing right now and have seen in the past elections. So I think this midterm election has really shown the results of those efforts that started back in the early 70s with the Democratic Party.
So that you would draw back the roots all the way.
Correct.
To
yes.
the 70s.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, that is a long waiting period. Now, you were a member of the Democratic National Committee, and you were just talking about some of the things that the party was trying to work out. What was your involvement like with them, and did you go to the convention? Were you a delegate?
Well, yes, I was a delegate at the convention, but mostly with my job at the convention was to look after the people from Georgia. What we did was we assigned a person or several people to each state, and a Georgian they would stay with the state. They would go to all their caucuses. They would meet with them and I think that was a help to keep Jimmy's name right in front of everybody, even though he didn't have any real big problems there at that convention. I think it helped for each, and then of course, when he went into the presidency, there was some of that continuation of those people that when he wanted to do, he would come through with these projects like the Panama Canal Treaties. Those same people made the contacts with those people in other states. So it was a continuing thing that went on from something that we had developed during the convention. My work with the Democratic National Convention was very short. It was not a time in my life that I could involve myself politically.
Okay.
It was time for me to just be at home. And so I gave my seat up to someone else. And so there's not a lot that I can actually say on that particular time.
Sure. Now, you had mentioned, and I wanted to get back to, coming from New Hampshire and then down to Florida with the campaign. You said Florida was very difficult. What was it about Florida?
Well, Wallace was very strong then. You would say now looking back, but on the in the Panhandle, Wallace was very strong then. And in the southern part of Florida, Senator Jackson was very strong. You know enough about Florida to know that it's made up of a lot of different personalities and a lot of different people.
Sure.
And a lot of different interests. And, well, I don't know the interests are all there. It seems that, well, it is. It's a complex state. And so that really didn't give us much of a voter. We couldn't find any particular part of Florida that we was that strong in.
Okay, you couldn't
concentrate. And so we had to concentrate on. So we really actually concentrated on the Panhandle.
Okay.
Because we felt like that was where we could do our best work, and we concentrated. We started with Jacksonville because Jacksonville was such an important town, and then we moved on over into the Panhandle, and we felt if we could. And we ran into some interesting stories there because those Wallace people were bound and determined that he was going to do well there. So it was got to be some really, I don't know. Some of the stories I didn't even write them in my book. It was kind of interesting.
What were those stories? Hand-to-hand combat with the Wallace
Well, it was
people?
combat. Yeah, a lot of veteran campaigners, and they knew a lot about campaigning, and some of us perhaps we didn't, and so we had to be very careful in some of those little cities in Florida. But it paid off.
Okay.
It was an interesting part of the campaign.
So when did the Peanut Brigade become the Peanut Brigade?
Well, I think it was a national, and I don't remember which one it was, but it was just Georgians before that, Georgians campaigning.
Okay, doesn't have the same ring to it.
Yeah, and later on, it might have been after Wisconsin, and that it became known as the Peanut Brigade, which was a help because if we went into a city and we had people that would immediately go to a radio station, and these were people that had campaigned local elected officials, and they had worked in their own campaigns, so they would know how to go into a radio station or a TV station. And when they mentioned the Peanut Brigade, by the time we had knocked on a door or gone into an office, say, "Oh, the Peanut Brigade, I heard you all here in town." So
you developed a reputation.
Yeah, yes. And of course, having that type of, I guess, I don't know what it is, the Peanut Brigade. I mean, there was no sophistication there. It was just, hey, I want to see the Peanut Brigade. What is this all about?
What are these peanuts? Who are they? And so we've talked around it a little bit, and Hamilton Jordan's organizing. But did you get a sense that there was an ultimate strategy to the Peanut Brigade? Did Hamilton Jordan have a long view, and you guys were filling in the framework that he created, or were you making it up as you went along?
No, I don't think. No, it was not after New Hampshire. There was actually nothing had been planned, and the reason I know that is that on the plane back to Georgia from New Hampshire, I sat down with Hamilton, and I said, "Hamilton, what's your next plan now to take?" He said, "I don't have that." And I said, "Oh, well, I can get 300 people to go." And he looked around, he thought, "Well, we don't want the national television to hear you say that because I don't believe that can happen." But it did. You could fill up a plane and send them into another state or put buses into these other states. And so no, it was just when a need would arise, and they would say, "Well, we don't have anybody on foot, or we don't have anybody in that particular state because they had not had time to organize."
Quickly assemble the brigade.
Yeah, so we were everywhere. When we moved into a state, if there was an event somewhere, I know it was one event in Maryland, and Rosen was going to be there. And we took off all of our little cartoon campaign
paraphernalia,
material, and with no buttons, no hats, nothing. And we would just mix ourselves in with the party. And when we went through the receiving line, she could hardly keep a straight face. We would march through there. "Mrs. Carter, we're so happy you're in our city. We wish your husband good luck." And she would just greet us, And that happened a number of times, that we would just sort of go in as a supporter from that city.
Oh, goodness.
And yeah, it worked for us. We had a good time, but we were serious about what we were doing. And I know on those, higher, when we would go to the shift changes for the automobile industry, and we were all over those parking lots, and nobody seemed to mind being out there at 2 o'clock in the morning asking someone to vote for their friend Jimmy Carter. And it had a strong appeal, I think.
I can imagine. So there were times where you were both very strong in your identification as a Georgian, and then other times where you would hide that identity and mix in to make it look like there was a lot of support from the state.
Oh, yeah.
And your accents didn't give you away?
Oh, my accent. One time I know I had a man look at me, and I gave him the entire story about Jimmy Carter, and he looked at me and he said, "Young lady, I have not understood a word you have said." He said, "But I love the way you said it. I'll take this brochure and I'll read about your friend Jimmy Carter." So yeah, the accents I think were totally different, and yes, that proved that we were truly from the South. There was no doubt about where we were from.
So you went on to write an entire book about the Peanut Brigade, which I introduced in your introduction. But can you still give us a little bit of insight about why you decided to write this book? What was that process like? It's quite an extensive study, not just of the Peanut Brigade, but of Jimmy Carter.
Well, the Peanut Brigade was a part of it, but that was not my reason for writing it. I frankly think that in history, Jimmy Carter will sort of rise up as one of the best presidents to serve this country. And that was part of what my book is, the things that he was able to accomplish in the 4 years that he was in the White House, the integrity of that administration, the people that worked for him, the loyalty to this man, and the loyalty to Rosalie and Jimmy has been such a part of what I think and find out to be true about them. Over the years, the same people that have supported them from everything that they have done in their political life, their public life, and also in the Carter Summer. And I think that speaks so much and gives so much credit to a couple. And that was one of the reasons, but I really would like for people to read this book with the idea that let me see what he accomplished as governor. And many, this is a Richard B. Russell library. Yes. Richard Russell was the governor that reorganized the state government. And he was probably the first one that had done it. He saw a necessity that this needed to be done. It had not been done after Richard Russell. No governor had attempted this until Jimmy Carter was governor. And he saw the necessity for reorganizing state government. It was a tremendous task to undertake.
Sure.
And not very many governors could do this, and of course they could only serve 4 years. So he was the one that reorganized state government. That is held true to even my Republican friends will admit that the zero-based budgeting, the reorganizing of the state government still holds true in the state of Georgia in our government. And so I think those things, I would like for people to recognize that in this particular man as in his office. And then the Panama Canal Treaties, we are beginning to see the effects of that. I think very few people really understood how serious that problem was in the Panama Canal. And if it had not happened, we would have had some very, very serious, costly, not only in money, but probably in people. And the Army would have had to have gone in, perhaps. I don't know that this would have happened. But it seemed to be headed in that direction. And of course, the Camp David Peace Accords have held true to this day. So the things that he accomplished, I would like for people to recognize that. And the Peanut Brigade was, I had wrote about that because that was so very close to me, and I knew a lot about that.
And that's the lens.
And it was unique.
Right, and that's the lens through which you saw a lot of Jimmy Carter as a politician.
Correct, yes.
Was that involvement. What are some of the very best memories you take away from your experience with the Peanut Brigade? I mean, there are a lot of very amusing stories that you share in the book, but...
Well, with the Peanut Brigade, it was very frenzied. I was, I think, always the cheerleader, and it was a very frenzied part. But I think I owe young Hugh Carter, Jr., who was a cousin to Jimmy. I owe him a lot of credit because he left his job. He didn't leave it permanent, but I would just whine and I need you, Hugh. And so being with those people and the friendships that we developed there. But my best memories of the times that I would spend with Rosalind Carter on the campaign trail and Miss Lillian. Now, I did not campaign with Rosalind after 1975,
Okay.
but I just could see what a tremendous person she was. And this is not her forte. This is not what she said had distinguished herself in life to be.
Had envisioned for her life to be.
Correct, yes. But this role was so important to her, and how genuine she is and how much she really cares for people. And she's such a genuine person. And I think that probably those are my best memories.
Getting to
and
know
of course,
her.
being with Miss Lillian and hearing her story.
I can only imagine what that was like.
Yeah.
So you essentially got to witness Rosalind Carter become Rosalind Carter.
Correct.
At least the public persona
yes.
that we all know.
Yes.
You saw that evolution.
Yeah, I remembered how proud I was of Rosalind, because I think of the days that she was so timid and shy that she'd have a little piece of paper and she'd just read from it. Mm-hmm. And then the day I watched her on television go to New York and meet the Pope. Mm-hmm. And then anytime that she would, when the campaign would ask her to do something, she would do it, even if she felt like that she just absolutely could not. And then she did it with such a spirit of, this is what Rosalind Carter needs to do. And so she just put all of those little fears behind her and did such a good job.
Rose to the occasion.
But, when I talk about her, that doesn't mean that I don't think that Jimmy Carter is tremendous. I, at some time, would like to just take his brain apart and just see how it functions, because it's totally amazing what he comes up with and the things that he can do and decide, this is a choice that I'm going to make, and this is what I'm going to do.
Well, and just the many facets, the engineer, the military man, the humanitarian, the religious man, and all those seem to not fight one another.
But, you have this engineering personality that he does, he's an engineer, but yet he has this in him that he cares so for people too. So you put those two together, and you don't have that happen very often.
No, that's truly a gift. So after Carter wins the presidential election, he brings a lot of people with him from Georgia up to D.C., and you were one of those people. You served as the I don't want to botch up the title, the Assistant Chief of Protocol in the U.S. Department of State. How did that come about? How were you invited to do that? What was life in D.C. like?
Well, I'm a sort of a natural social person anyway, and I have no problem meeting people. But that was my personality. But also, I had had trained myself with the wife of a banker in a large major bank, and for years I've had to do that, and I've sort of played that role. And I said, well, if he's going to meet these foreign dignitaries, these international people, they should meet a person from the South first, so we could speak the language by the time that they would know the language that we spoke. And I actually thought that I could do a good job for him doing that, and it turned out to be a good job for me. I had a lot of help. The State Department is totally different from the White House. It's organized in little sections, and everybody has their duties that they have to perform. So it was, it made it much easier. My job was much easier because there was always somebody there that knew what you were going to have to be faced with, and I couldn't have done it otherwise.
Someone to tell you exactly what you were getting into, what to expect.
Well, they were just so well trained, and there were nothing. This was not new to them. It was new to me, but I just felt like I could do it, and I think probably, and I never really made any serious mistakes, I don't think.
And did you live in D.C. for that time that you served at the State Department?
Was I what?
Did you move to D.C. and live there?
Oh, I lived there, yes. I was very fortunate living in one of the most well-known houses in Georgetown. It was a matter of house sitting, and his home was, he was actually an editor of the Washington Post. And so my house, when I lived there, part of the agreement was that the children of the family that had moved on could use the house too, use the tennis court. They could come and have parties in the house. Well, it really didn't matter to me because I was so busy, it didn't matter. And yes, I lived in Georgetown, and it was just great.
Okay, well, let's take a little step back in history, in the timeline, and let's talk about the early Democratic Party, maybe before you were intimately involved with campaigning, but what was going on with early Democrats in Georgia?
Well, the first memory I have was I was just a young child, and my uncle was born, raised, and went to college in Indiana that had come down to Georgia to run a business. And my dad, who was born and raised in Georgia. And of course, I suppose that my uncle, being from Indiana, was much more conservative. And I can remember those two guys back and forth in our kitchen, arguing politics and arguing it. And back then we only had a real strong, the Democratic Party.
Right.
But, you know, candidates with different views were there. We didn't, it was not really all that bad because you would have them very conservative and the people who were not as conservative.
But all Democrats.
All Democrats, correct. And they would argue back and forth, and that was my first time. But the thing that I got out of that was that what they wanted a governor and what they wanted the people to be was what would affect your pocketbook, your economic, which governor would be more economically interested in what this businessman wanted and needed. And I think that was early on, that was what was important to them, was the, are they going to raise my taxes? Are they going to do this? And then I noticed as later on, it began to be real important, education.
Okay.
Became to be real important in their arguments back and forth.
Supplanting economics for them? Or supplanting the debate about economics, or just being added into the mix?
Well, it was economically, they wanted a government that would help them as a businessman and vote. They used to say the word, they vote your pocketbook. Okay. And that meant that whatever you did, what you wanted your government to help you as a businessman. Both of my uncle and my dad were sort of agribusiness. And so that was important to them. Then I think education began to be important to them as Georgia became a little bit better established economically. But then it became a part of who can we trust. And that was the thing that was important in Jimmy Carter's campaign. Who do we trust? And that was very, and that was, I think, such a plus on his side, that he was somebody that they seemed to be able to plus. But early on, even though there was only one party, you certainly would have people with different issues and certain beliefs. Then the word liberal began to creep into the conversations, and that would take on different meanings. And it did not mean that my dad was liberal with a lot of his feelings. He was, in a lot of his beliefs, he was not. Well, there were these things just had not risen to the surface before.
Sure. And
so, you know, that began to take on another part of the party and the way that people began, which, you know, there again was important.
Right, and this was...
And to address all of the issues that we had, not just economic and the things that, but I think most of it goes back to that, though.
at the heart of it all, you
Correct.
see
Yeah.
the economics.
A lot of it goes back to that.
When do you remember about what time period the language of liberal being introduced into the mix and coming to mean social and cultural?
You know what? I wish I could really know. I'm sure that after 1970, after 1972, in 1973, I think that was probably when it was started, but it was not a big rumbling then. Mm-hmm. But I think that was possibly when when the platforms were established and they began to ask for different things in the platforms. And they had some very, very strong women then that began to, and in 1976 when they put together the platform for the Democratic Party. And of course, I don't know what the platform for the Republican Party was, but I'm sure it's quite different.
Sure. And these strong women, where were they coming in? What was their role?
Well, elected officials. They were mostly the elected officials, but they had a voice, but they were not quite strong enough then to get the things that they really were wanting to put forth. Of course, the ERA was happening at the same time, and that brought a lot of people out that could voice what they wanted and what they thought was needed. Yes, but and I understand it's coming back again. I think it is, to see if they can ratify it. So I don't know, but it's there again. I was very disappointed that the ERA was not ratified in Georgia, but I think women took another role and moved on, and certainly the African American women have become very strong in a lot of situations too. So, even with that strength behind them, I think they've done a very commendable job.
So even with the ERA not being
correct.
ratified, perhaps it propelled certain people forward.
But I do think that there are a lot of different fractions even in the two parties. So maybe someday we'll have a third party. Who knows? I don't know what's going to come out of that. I really would like to know. I hope it happens in my lifetime.
To see the emergence of a third party in Georgia or nationally? Or...
Yeah, I would love to see that.
So how have you seen politics in Georgia change? And what has remained the same? I mean, you did point to this economics is staying at the heart of things, but where have the consistencies been, and where have we diverged from history and politics?
From the history, I'm not sure that I know exactly how to answer that. I'll have to think about that a little bit, or maybe you can ask me in a different way. Maybe I'll understand it a little better.
Sure. So where have you seen, if we're to trace back to when your father and uncle are sitting around your kitchen table, how are politics in Georgia different today from when they were talking about politics back then?
I think it's much more difficult now for a candidate, so much more difficult. They have to address so many issues now. And, the health problem, back then, healthcare now is a big issue. And back years ago, healthcare was not an issue. Roads, schools, business, and those things it seemed much simpler then. But I don't know that we were addressing problems that needed to be addressed. So I think they've moved forward in a good way by addressing, like, the healthcare problems. We actually don't have a very healthy nation, though.
No.
I think that we have some problems that people need to be responsible for themselves, and I would like to see that happen. But because we did not have a lot of health problems years ago that we have now. People were healthier, and so that sort of had to come as these trends now have changed. And I think if anybody's watching this, they'll know what I'm speaking about, that we're not a healthy nation.
In the physical sense.
Correct, yes. And so the government has had to step in where I feel like that they should not have had to step in. And so that's one of the changes. But people do, they, there are problems that were not addressed back we do have problems now that we didn't have years ago. We have drugs now that they didn't have when my dad and my uncle were arguing. So it was an easier time for them. But the parties have to meet these challenges. They're here. Mm-hmm. They are here for them. And so I think over the years that they have known that they're going to be faced with this. And so the candidates for governor this year, they both often faced these problems, the health issues, the mm-hmm. school issues, the transportation, and those things that, and it's a tough job. It's just a tough job. I don't know, sometimes you wonder.
What type of person wants to take on that job?
Yes, it's got to be a really dedicated person that wants to make a difference. Mm-hmm. And they would not get out there and work 20 hours a day to try to do this if they really didn't think they could make a difference.
Right. You can't do this half-heartedly.
Oh, God. It's got to be tough.
So you alluded to the current election, the present day politics, an election that as of today hasn't been officially certified even for governor. But what would you say to a candidate like Stacey Abrams? What could she learn from Jimmy Carter or from what you saw about campaigning?
The candidates, mm-hmm. Stacey, when she was running.
Yeah, what lessons could she have taken away from?
Well, I would like to see, because it's very difficult for me to say this because Georgians invaded many states during the presidential campaign, but I think that's different. It's a national level. Mm-hmm. But I actually would like to see less involvement with other people coming into our state. I think that this is the governor of the state of Georgia, and they will be governing Georgia. And because we're always on an international level, we're always looking for that. We have to have that. Sure. But I would like to see it become a campaign for the state of Georgia by Georgians. And I think these people that come in, it's a famous person comes in, it creates excitement, and maybe people are made aware of it more than, and maybe they say something that someone is attracted to. Mm-hmm. So, I can't fault either of the candidates for bringing these people in, but I personally would like for it to be on a grassroots level, and Georgians campaigning for a Georgia governor. And friends and colleagues
Correct. Of the candidates.
Yes, yeah,
standing
that's
to
right.
Speak for them.
But there again, if a well-known person comes into your state and they just say one thing that somebody it's attractive to a person, that might be the thing that says, okay, I can vote for them. Mm-hmm. But and probably it just, I would like to see it be a little calmer. Okay. I would like for people to, when you have a debate, to actually debate on the issues. And we're always wishing for that. Somehow it never happens.
Right.
But I would like to see people calmly talk back and forth to each other and have a debate.
Do you think there's a loss of civility
in politics
and campaigning?
Yes. And how do we come back to that? It's but now, perhaps our generations, our future generations, are more accustomed to that, mm-hmm. and they might be able to sift through that. Hopefully they can sift through that and finally come down to, okay, this person can do the job. Hopefully they can do it, and I think they will, because they have a lot more that they have to absorb every day that that we actually did not have.
This is something that they're
Yeah.
they're conditioned.
Correct. But I'd always, I don't think there's ever anything that can take the place of good manners, though, in being civil to each other. I don't think anything could ever replace that. As if it's a learning situation, if they are, and that's what it is. You are learning what this candidate is about, and so I think that if we went back to being a little more, the campaigns being a little calmer, that might work, and having people come into your town and meeting and listening. You know, that's been going on for years in Georgia. With the people would come into a town and you listen to them, and that's still going on, which is good. It's okay.
So maybe we need to launch a Peanut Brigade 2.0. Take a page from the 70s and do some of that.
I think when they did that, it was called a Good Neighbor.
Okay.
The Good Neighbor campaign.
Right, that was the actual title of, that's what they called the governor's.
When he ran, yeah.
Okay.
It was called the Good Neighbor campaign. And, well, now we had candidates in my own county, Douglas County, that knocked on doors. But the problem is that it's not as easy to find people at home now.
This is true.
And so, you know, they try to do it now and meet people one-on-one at ball games and places like that. So they've had to design their campaigns totally different sometimes, and but that still works. So I know one of my candidates came down my street and talked to some new residents, and they would never have even thought about it. Well, you know, he ended up with them putting a sign in their yards. So it was that personal contact. And those things, I think, still help. I'm not sure. They obviously do, because they beg everybody to put a sign in your yard.
Right. And even just, you know, what happened in the last election, the numbers that both candidates got, the percentages, and how close it was.
Tremendously close. And I don't know that means that we are divided. I think there's just so many. We have a lot of different issues, and there are people that are very adamant about what they want, and you can't blame them for that.
Right. We're a more diverse state made up of many different people than previously. So in Carter's campaigns, you know, you're talking about the influx of people from out of state and the lack and the loss of civility. What else is different? I mean, imagine there was a whole different media approach for Jimmy Carter, or there wasn't really one at all. How have you
well,
seen
we didn't
that
have CNN then. You know, that's 24-hour news. So you could schedule everything for the 6 o'clock news, the 7 o'clock news, the 12 o'clock news. So you could do it that way, and then the few interviews that you could get. So now there's so much coverage that, and whether I should say this or not, I don't know, but there's always some television personality out there that wants to get his story across, and he wants to do his story his way. And there again, this future generation is going to have to sift through all of this. And I don't think that, you know, we didn't have that much media coverage. And what coverage you had was so very important that you would court it, you would go after it. But now the newspapers were tremendously important then.
Okay.
And I'm not saying that the newspapers are not important now.
But they're in the mix of many other
Correct.
types of media.
So, you know, you would always want those good newspaper, you would want those good articles in the paper or the front page, if you could ever get something on the front page. And editorials. I'm still a person who reads a newspaper, so it's hard for me to say that nobody pays much attention to it. But we know it. The truth is they don't. They pay more attention to what they see, social media, television,
Sure.
whatever. Yeah. But yeah, that's a lot of difference. CNN has made that difference. All these other stations that I'm not even aware of.
So many,
Yeah.
all the time.
Well,
Everywhere.
that gives the candidate a much better an opportunity, though, to put himself out there, or to put themselves out there.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, how much did Carter have to run his presidential bid?
Under the federal elections, in the primaries, and of course in the primaries, a person could spend their own money.
Mm-hmm.
But in the primaries, the campaign only had $21 million, and that was what they could spend on television coverage, the candidates' travels, $21 million, $36 million total for the primaries and the general election. $36 million total. That was the checkoff. But now I can't say that was all the money that was spent. It was not, because the parties could spend money.
Okay.
For the Democratic Party could step forward and they could spend money in the general elections. But it was nothing compared to what they spend now. It's just absolutely nothing. And there again, I hope someday we will have. I really am totally amazed at the amounts of money that these candidates can raise. It's amazing.
And the amount that they do spend.
Yeah. Yes.
That's certainly a huge shift in politics and in campaigning.
Well, I think that probably before a candidate even announces, he made sure that he's going to be able to get his message out there on television and that media, mm-hmm. because obviously that's where a lot of, when we think about how many people actually vote, that's just a lot of people to have to make a contact with. And I don't know, they can't knock on that many doors.
Well, Dot Padgett, I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to sit today and share your experiences and your insight into Georgia politics and Jimmy Carter and campaigning. It's been really a pleasure.
Well, thank you. And I would like to invite you, since you're here, to go ahead and visit the center, and visit and do a little tour through the library if you haven't done it. And it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.